we've been talking about the question of what happens if someone is in the middle of bringing their sacrifices, and there are 3 sacrifices that are brought to the temple. Then after they bring the sacrifices, they're going to shave their hair, and the hair's going to be burnt on the altar. And then at that point, they can drink wine, and they can come into contact with dead bodies. And I guess they could shave again, although they don't have any hair at this point, so shaving's not relevant. But certainly drinking wine and coming into contact with the dead is very, very relevant. And we were talking about what happens if, for example, one of the sacrifices is found to be not deficient. What if it doesn't work during this whole process? And now we're going to jump into the 11th Mishnah, the closing Mishnah of the 6th chapter. What happens if they come into contact if they become tameh, if they come into contact with a dead person while this is all going on? And it's difficult to imagine what the circumstances are, but the Mishnah is going to bring an example. Mishnah is rakalav echad min hadomim venitma. So someone for whom one of the blood, so the blood of one of the sacrifices has been sprinkled, venitma, and they become unclean. So they must come into contact with a dead body in some way during this process. Rabbi Eliezer Omer soter et hakol. Rabbi Eliezer says everything's cancelled. Now, Rabbi Eliezer has already taught us back in the 3rd chapter that someone to whom this happens doesn't have to repeat their whole Nazirut. Rabbi Eliezer holds they only need to keep 7 days clean, and then they can purify themselves and come back. So he's not saying their whole Nazirut is cancelled, but he's saying the sacrifices are cancelled. They have to bring them again. Rabbi Eliezer Omer soter et hakol. Everything's cancelled. The sacrifice, all 3 are no good. For Chachamim Omrim, Yavi Sha'ar Korbonotav Vehitar. The sages say, look, he can just bring the remaining sacrifices and purify himself. So you come into contact with a dead body on the 3rd day, and on the 7th day, the water with the ashes of the red heifer are sprinkled on you. You come on the 7th day and you're clean. So the sages are saying that's okay. He can bring the remaining sacrifices and he can purify himself, and he can complete his period of Nazirut. Why are we doing this? Well, we've already ruled in the Mishnah that if one sacrifice has been accepted, that effectively ends the period of Nazirut. After one sacrifice has been dealt with, they can drink wine and they can become unclean and so on. And the Mishnah is going to bring an example. Very interesting that many of the examples that the Mishnah is bringing, many of the practical examples, or the people who are named, are women. Now, we've learned already that the halakha of Nazir is essentially gender neutral. A woman or a man can equally become a Nazir, but it's very Nazir or Nazira, but very interesting that when the Gemara relates incidents, so for example, we had the woman who was drunk when she made the oath. We had Queen Helena, who was a Nazirah for 21 years. And now we're going to have Miriam the Tadmori. Amrulo, they said to him, the sages then said to Rabbi Eliezer, remember, Rabbi Eliezer wants to cancel all the sacrifices. So the sages said to Rabbi Eliezer, Ma'aseh b'Miriam hatadmorit. It happened that Miriam the Tadmorit, this seems to be someone from Palmyra, by the way. Seems to be that she's from Palmyra. That's what Tadmorit is. Shenizrak aleha echad min hadamim. So one of the, essentially the blood of one of these sacrifices was sprinkled on her behalf. So she must have been a Nazira. Uvau ve'amrula al bita shehi masakenet. And someone came and told her that her daughter was dangerously ill. So she must have gone off to take care of her daughter or to see her daughter. V'halcha. So she went off. U'metzata shemeta. And she found that she died. She found that her daughter had died. So clearly at this point, she becomes tmeah. She can no longer come back in the temple. Amru Chachamim, the sages said, Tavi sha'ar kabanoteha ve'yitar. The sages said she could offer her remaining sacrifices and she should become purified, i.e., after the purification, after the third and the seventh day, she can offer the remaining sacrifices. So that story of Miriam Hatadmori, Miriam from Palmyra, is how we finish the 6th chapter. And then in the 7th chapter, we're going to start investigating questions of conflicts of values. And much of the rest of the tractate, by the way, will deal with conflicts of values and relative values. But the 7th chapter begins with the question as to who is holier, the high priest or the Nazir. So we've heard about Queen Helena. She was a Nazirah for 21 years. And we've heard about Miriam from Tadmori. Well, what is their status with relative to someone who's already in the Beit Mikdash? By the way, who's necessarily a man, because the kuna only goes to men. Kohen Gadol ben Nazir einan mitamim bi krovotehem. Neither a high priest nor a Nazir can defile themselves for their relatives. And this is a pasuk in it's specified in the verses describing Nazirut, and it's specified for the high priest at the beginning of Parshat Emor in Vayikra in Leviticus. The high priest does not come into contact with a dead body, even for his father and his mother. So they have the same status. Okay, let's put out this scenario. They were walking along the road. Mate mitzvah. So they're together, right? The Nazir and the high priest are walking there. They're walking together along this road. And jointly, they find a mate mitzvah, an abandoned corpse. Well, the halacha with a mate mitzvah, that's why a mate mitzvah literally means a death who's commanded. I mean, I translate it as an abandoned corpse. It's called a mate mitzvah because the halacha is you stop everything. You don't even read the Megillah to take care of the dead body. You can't do anything until the dead body is buried. So what are we going to do? Matzu mate mitzvah. They found a mate mitzvah. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yitama Kohen Gadol. Rabbi Eliezer says the high priest should defile himself. Rabbi Eliezer says the high priest should defile himself, should take care of the dead body. Yitama Kohen Gadol. Ve'al yitamei Nazir. The Nazir does not defile himself. Rabbi Eliezer, does like extreme positions. For example, if there's a bris on the 8th day, we've already taught that Rabbi Eliezer will say, to carry out a brit on Shabbat, you can make a fire, to smelt a knife, to create a tool to carry out Brit Milah on the 8th day. And the Chachamim would say, no, thank you very much. Please bring the knife before Shabbat. But Rabbi Eliezer takes these positions. So he would say the Kohen Gadol would defile himself. The sages say Yitamei Nazir. The Chachamim would say, no. The Nazir should defile himself. Ve'al yitamei Kohen Gadol. And the Kohen Gadol should not defile himself. Well, they're both going to bring their reasoning. Amar lahen Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer said, Yitamei Kohen she'eino mevi korban al tumato. Rabbi Eliezer says the priest should defile himself because if he's defiled, he doesn't have to bring a sacrifice. Remember that the Nazir, if he comes into contact with a dead body, he has to bring a korban specifically for that defilement. There's a specific issue for which he brings a korban. So, and the Kohen Gadol doesn't need to do that. So Rabbi Eliezer reasons, he works on his reasoning, that this issue must be more severe for the Nazir. Yitamei Kohen ve'eino. So Yitamei Kohen, the Kohen should defile himself, she'eino mevi korban al tumato, because he doesn't have to bring a sacrifice when he comes into contact with a dead body, the al yitame Nazir shehu mevi korban al tumato. And the Nazir should not defile himself because he does have to bring a sacrifice for his uncleanness. Amrula, the sages replied to him. Very interesting. The sages are actually going to get into an issue of status here. This feels a bit uncomfortable to us today. Well, maybe not. Anyway, this is what the sages are going to say. Amrulo, Yitamei Nazir. The sages say that the Nazir should defile himself. Shekdushato kedushat sha'a. His holiness is temporary. Kedushat sha'a, the kedusha of a single hour. He's temporarily holy. The al yitameh kohen, and the kohen shouldn't defile himself. Shekdushato kedushat olam. His holiness is everlasting. The Chachamim are remembering this verse. Actually, that applies to Pinchas. Remember, Pinchas, we are into questions of life and death, actually, after he kills after he kills Zimri, he in front of the tent of meeting in the desert, he's given this brit shalom, and then the text says, "V'haitalo ulzaro acharav brit Kuhunat olam." He and his descendants shall have a covenant of everlasting priesthood. Berit Kuhunat olam. And the sages say about the high priest, Kedushato Kedushat olam, his holiness endures forever, therefore he shouldn't defile himself. I mean, interestingly, we know, right, in the time of the Mishnah, that the high priesthood was bought and was sold for money. So when the sages say that his holiness is Kedushat Olam, it's optimistic and it's idealistic.